Hey guys, welcome back to another Architect React. And in today's episode, I have the exciting world of Alice in Borderland. Alice in Borderland is a series that follows the main character Arisu through Shibuya intersection, an intersection that is prominently known for a lot of people. It's equivalent to Times Squares in New York, but situated in Tokyo. And he finds himself navigating this world with his three friends, then eventually being pulled into a different world where he has to play games with his friends or forced to play games with his friends to eventually find a way to come back into the world he once knew. So one of the most exciting things about any show is the people. And a lot of it situates around how people create these experiences. All the stories are always about the people. We always interact with architecture as the background. Architecture has never been a foreground. Then why is this series more relevant? Because right off the get-go, the main character as a gamer already enters into the world. He finds himself at the Shibuya intersection and entering into a bathroom stall, and when he comes out, the infrastructure of Tokyo remains the same. It still has power. Everything is still there, except the population that once used to be millions is now reduced to few hundreds. And what happens is the desolate architecture, the abandoned buildings, all the skyscrapers become the foreground. Eventually, this world, we find out, is controlled by some other higher being. And as we are navigating in this game-like environment, we find ourselves always thinking, what's going to happen next about the building? So to situate yourself, the main character is now instantly forced into a first game. And this game is forcing him to navigate between or make choices between two doors, one which he lives or he dies. And as he's making these choices, he forces the audience to now think spatially, because the moment he entered the building, he became spatially aware of where the layout of the building was. He's really good at game. And as a gamer, Arisu is now laying out the floor plan. He's making the audience think we need to be spatially aware. As he navigates from one door to another door to another door, eventually leading to his success, he eventually conquers the game, but leaves the audience in the first episode thinking about spatial awareness, thinking about what the architecture can entail into the second episode. So spatial awareness becomes a concept. This is something that we have to grasp as architects. How deep is 20 feet? How wide is a 30-foot space? How tall is a 5-foot by 5-foot by 15-foot corridor? We have to navigate these spaces mentally. And these spaces evoke feeling, evoke thoughts. And in the second game, we're forced into a multi-story building. We're asked to think about how this building is in a confined space. Despite the fact we're looking at these buildings with blue hue and this night lit building. And what you end up thinking about is how these arenas make you think about the inside of the arena. The game field environment forces the players to think about how to navigate across the field, which is part of the city, which is part of the architecture. So as a viewer, you're thinking, hey, what is advantageous? And there, another concept is introduced: hierarchy, class hierarchy, social hierarchy, height hierarchy, however you want to call it, that it makes it a point for you to think from above looking down. How is people below me socially interacting with me? Monetarily, if they're lower than me, how they interact. If I'm higher up on the skyscraper, then the people below me are lower than me. So the mentality of hierarchy in architecture is captured in this game. Another thing that happens that I don't think anyone thinks about is as we're captured in these arenas, these game fields, there's a stark reason why we study prison architecture. One of the things we study is to keep the psychological mind of a prisoner intact while having him navigate through his daily life, waking up, going to get food, then eventually moving to yard, then coming back. You don't want to psychologically break down or isolate your user. And in this sense, this game arenas do this really well. Either you create tunnels to isolate the actual user, or creating hard lines, or you create spaces which are limited despite the fact the user might think that there's freedom. So you end up looking into the buildings. You look at these mega monolithic structures that are inspired by brutalist architecture, pure concrete form, but you're now looking into the building. Then you move into the third game, which is the first time you see an interaction between nature and building. The botanical garden is a good example of when the actual user is inside a monolithic structure, but at the same time interacting with nature. You find Arisu, the main character, touching soil, crying, even though it's a very intimate space. It is a space where you go with your family, you interact with your friends, you enjoy the view of nature. You are still in the confine of a building. And those interactions are intimate, and that is captured in that episode. Without giving away any spoilers, he leaves out with sadness. And that is captured by the environment. In the very next episode, you see him getting rained on. And the synonymous subtlety in which architecture is influencing the main character is always shown. You always find these very small notion of confinement being shown in the game, and then these open spaces, which themselves are also an open prison. Then you slowly navigate to a beach, hotel, luxury resort destination. And it's the first time you actually get to see sunlight in the entire first 4 episodes. And you find yourself still looking internally into these monolithic structure, these massive stadium structure, whenever you're thinking about the arena. And eventually this beach becomes one of the arena, one of the games where the main character has to play. And it becomes another contrast where you are looking at a resort as something you go and seek pleasure in. Yet, this is a place where you have to find a murder, and it becomes a place of entrapment. Everyone is trying to escape from it. Yet, everyone in real life is drawn to it. So there's always this small notion of hierarchy, contrast, things that we think are subtle, but are being introduced in layers, and eventually shaping your view of architecture around you. Then we find Arisu, our protagonist, running through the second season of the city. And everything now becomes about the city. The first season is all about looking in to the structure, looking into the actual arenas, looking into the actual building environment, game environments. Now the game environment becomes the city. And we get a whole new insight into this urban scale. We look at the city as a playing field. We look at how it becomes a glass maze where you're looking at these empty skyscrapers and you're navigating through them, but you're still trapped. Even though you have shipyards and larger playing arenas, but they're now at an urban scale. They're no longer one building. They're no longer this one isolated event. It's actually an entire oil refinery. It's an entire infrastructure there. So now the things are becoming much bigger. Again, the notion of hierarchy, people being higher above, is still there. All of these are being slowly introduced to us. And then we find the smallest shift. The shift of hope in our main character is then captured in the nature infiltrating into the urban landscape. The growth of trees, the growth of nature, and how that influences abandoned architecture, how that influences urban decay. What happens when you take humanity out and before the building collapses and the nature takes over? You have a building that's infused with trees and gardens and things that are growing on it, but yet it has yet to collapse. And how would that infrastructure look like? The building ceases function. The world starts to decay. And then we start getting a different perspective of the world, that the world itself is limited. and eventually he finds himself coming back into the real world. So these concepts of urban decay, these concepts of how to capture human emotion in architecture, pushing architecture in the forefront, is something very unique about this series. I highly recommend for anyone who wants to become an architect and study architecture anthropology, how space affects you, how space affects human experience, to actually look at this series and analyze how the confinement of the actual game reflected the confinement of the users, how each game forced the person to navigate through. And for those who actually watched the series, let me know in the comments below what you think architecturally about these series. Until next time. Follow for more content.